Good afternoon, everyone. A hush has fallen over the room, which I'm going to take as being my cue. Thank you for participating with us in this last panel of the day. This panel is going to provide a capstone to the day's discussions by tackling the difficult and vitally important issue of reconciliation, which has already come up at several points during the discussions. Reconciliation is one of the 5 key principles of complementary peace and justice that was identified by the Nuremberg Declaration 10 years ago. And the document says about reconciliation, rebuilding relationships between formerly antagonistic groups and strengthening the capacity of societies to transform themselves and their animosities contribute to the search for peace. Reconciliation requires the restoration of trust in equitable public institutions and respect for equal rights. It entails dialogue on conflicting versions of the past and addressing justice, accountability, and the interests of victims. But reconciliation is very complex in practice. While reconciliation is vital to ensuring long-term peace and to the stability and health of the post-conflict society, it's an incredibly difficult result to even envision in the aftermath of a conflict, especially when that conflict has been the site of terrible atrocities. Reconciliation aspires that perpetrators and victims should find a way not only to cease violence or to engage in a justice process, but actually to be able to live together in a common society. So its aspirations are at the opposite extreme from the experience of a conflict. And it can seem to be, in that sense, very elusive. A second way in which reconciliation is complex in practice is that the capacity of transitional justice processes to contribute meaningfully to reconciliation is uncertain and contested. So a few years ago, Ellen Scarr wrote an article outlining the very limited empirical work that had been done at that point on TJ processes and reconciliation. And she found that our expectations were mostly hopeful or highly context dependent rather than based on the evidence that had been produced at that time. But even conceptually, transitional justice processes are not likely to be sufficient to produce reconciliation on their own. So, for example, Louis Kriesberg argues that the prerequisites needed for reconciliation are shared truth, for example, through investigations, justice, through transitional justice perhaps, security in the sense of safety, and mutual regard, which he defines as recognizing each other's humanity and human rights. So in this conceptual sense even, transitional justice processes contribute to the conditions for reconciliation, but don't themselves achieve it. Then within the concept of reconciliation, there are a lot of pieces put together, and I'm going to try to tease out 4 of them just to mention them before I turn this over to our panelists as a sort of framework for what they're going to share. If reconciliation is about rebuilding social relationships, there are multiple kinds of relationships at stake. In a recent paper for the International Center for Transitional Justice, Paul Seiles sets out several kinds, including interpersonal relationships between perpetrators and victims, community relationships, and relationships with the institutions of government that may have been complicit. So if you have multiple relationships, you also have multiple kinds of processes needed to address rebuilding those relationships. Many observers have noted that you can't expect reconciliation to happen in a consistent or holistic way, but rather at varying paces and with varying levels of resistance or engagement from different parts of society. And then finally, reconciliation may be achieved on a continuum from a very thin version of mere coexistence to a very thick version of a very healthy mutual understanding and acceptance. So within this concept of reconciliation, we have these many multiple aspects that demand attention and complicate our efforts to understand how and why and whether reconciliation is happening at all. So today our 3 panelists are going to address 3 different aspects of reconciliation. And we're going to start with Betty Murungi, who is going to be discussing the role of truth in reconciliation. She asked me to keep her introduction very short. So I will just say, although there are many things that could be said about her great body of work in this area, that she was a commissioner on the Truth, Justice, and Reconciliation Commission of Kenya for a long while, as well as the Africa representative on the board of directors of the Trust Fund for Victims at the International Criminal Court. With this, I'll turn it over to Betty and introduce the other panelists immediately before they speak.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Elena. Good afternoon. I'm really excited to be here amongst very old friends and some new friends, and was really honored to have been asked to speak on this panel. I was asked to address the question on the role of truth in reconciliation. The short answer to that question is maybe truth has a role in reconciliation, but would also be yes if we were talking about truth plus justice would be able to contribute to reconciliation at both the individual and at the community level. I want to say that the commission that I served in, which was the Kenya Truth, Justice and Reconciliation Commission, included the word justice in the title of the commission. And this was after long consideration in elaborating the statute that created the Kenya Truth, Justice and Reconciliation Commission. At the very outset, the commissioners recognized that reconciliation was going a step too far in terms of putting that on the mandate of the Truth Commission, and in fact recommended that this was a long-term project that could be addressed by different bodies and by ensuring that there was institutional reforms to the many institutions that had been found complicit in abetting the violations that had taken place in Kenya over a period of 45 years that the Commission's mandate examined. But first, before I go further, I want to ask you to consider 5 critical issues in getting to a longer, more complex answer about the role of truth in reconciliation. One is, how is the truth generated? When we speak about truth, how is that truth generated? Is it officially sanctioned? That is, do you get to the truth through officially sanctioned bodies such as truth commissions or gachacha commissions, as our Rwandan friends would have us did? Or do we get to that truth through the newly very popular method of national dialogue processes, which are also officially sanctioned and very often elite-driven? There is also another route to get to this truth, which is through community and traditional processes. Again, we're beginning to see more of this becoming officially sanctioned as well, by having states appoint traditional leaders who themselves lead some of those community dialogue processes that come up with semi-authentic and officially sanctioned truths. And without getting into very detailed definitions about the type of truth, especially in this era of mass atrocities, one cannot escape the fact that the type of truth or the version of truth that we're talking about necessarily influences the trajectory of the reconciliation that is achieved, if it is achieved. And I think we have good examples from South Africa after the Truth Commission and after all that truth-telling that we all watched along with them on television, and the type, if any, reconciliation that occurred at the different levels, whether it is racial reconciliation, whether it was reconciliation amongst the different communities that live in South Africa, or between the genders. My second issue that I want you to consider is the legitimacy of the processes. Now, the Nuremberg Declaration recognizes that the peace and stability are more likely to prevail when causes of conflict are addressed in a manner that the affected societies perceive as legitimate, perceive as non-discriminatory and just, and when societies are able to deal honestly with their past. Now, a lot of the processes that I have witnessed are often do not fulfill any of these conditions. You find that women are excluded, certain victims of certain offenses are excluded, and in my mind, victims of sexual violence especially do not have a voice in some of these truth-telling processes, either because the processes themselves, the structures themselves do not permit victims of certain atrocity crimes to come forward and speak their truths. My third point is around what was mentioned in the first panel in the morning by David Talbot about truth being an element of accountability. This has often been the difficulty in really ensuring that truth leads to justice and therefore is able to contribute to reconciliation, because that's where it stops in most instances. In recent past, the truth is told, as in the case of the Kenyan TJRC, and then there is no accountability thereafter. So these victims come, pour their hearts out, tell their truths, and nothing happens after that. In some instances where the perpetrators were identified as official bodies, like in Kenya, the judiciary was one of the institutions that had been found complicit in violations, and what happened at the same time that the truth-telling process was going on, institutional reforms were also taking place, and the institutional restructuring and dealing with making sure that the judiciary was reformed led to some measure of justice in terms of that particular institution. The fourth point is around the typology and nature of the conflict itself. And in the morning, a question by Dr. Gahima, I think, raised the point of what kind of conflicts are we talking about now? What kind of truths are we going to tell from the atrocities that are occurring in interstate conflicts, which have now become increasingly common? What kind of context is it that we are having some of these truth-telling bodies? Mostly, it's in a context where the conflict is still ongoing, and that raises different problems and dilemmas. And finally, I want to raise the question around reconciliation as a state-building goal, when truth commissions or truth-telling processes are themselves being utilized by states to push the focus from truth to justice, to truth to reconciliation, so that then reconciliation becomes the goal of everything that is happening around the transitional justice processes. And I think if we're going to be honest, we're going to have to look at the questions of this shift of focus, and this is an unfortunate, I think, development. And in my opinion, I think it encourages the continued impunity. Victims are becoming increasingly cynical, and real reconciliation, whether between individuals, whether between communities, whether interstate, is becoming almost impossible to achieve. I'm hoping that we can discuss this a little further. Thank you.
Thank you, Betty. Our second speaker is Alison Smith, and she'll be speaking about demobilization, disarmament, and reintegration in the African context. Ms. Smith is the legal counsel and director of the International Criminal Justice Program for No Peace Without Justice. She also has extensive experience in Sierra Leone, having worked as the country director in Sierra Leone for No Peace Without Justice, served as the chief legal advisor to the vice president of Sierra Leone on the special court and on international humanitarian law, and also worked as acting head of office and senior legal advisor to the special court to assist with the completion and wrap up of its work in 2013. She also has extensive work with other countries and governments, advising among others, the Tibetan government in exile, the Thai government, Kosovar politicians, and so on and so on. So with that, I'll turn it over to Allison.
Thank you, Elena, and thank you. I wish I'd asked you to make my introduction brief too. I feel a little embarrassed, but okay. Thank you, everybody, and thank you particularly to the Nuremberg Academy for inviting me to speak here. You have fulfilled the long-term dream of an undergraduate law student to come to the birthplace of international justice, so I really appreciate the honor in being here. So I plan today to talk about DDR in Africa, focusing on two things primarily, one on the Sierra Leone experience and the other on challenges in the current context of DDR, and particularly in relation to extremist groups and DDR or release from extremist groups. First, I just wanted to contextualize the discussion by mentioning let's say the three generations of DDR that have been occurring since it first began in the 1960s. The first generation, let's say, is the more traditional DDR as we understand it, well-defined peace agreement, well-defined parties. You have essentially a formulaic approach of D, then R, and it goes according to that plan. And in general, the DDR was voluntarily entered by combatants. So in this first generation of DDR, the focus was very much on combatants and on getting them out, getting arms away from them, and reintegrating them into society. In the second generation of DDR, things were a little more complicated in terms of the context of the conflicts, and you had DDR in ongoing conflicts. You had perhaps not peace agreements, less defined parties, harder to distinguish between combatants and civilians, and so the focus shifted in a way from the combatant more towards a community focus. Of course, during the second phase of DDR, the second generation, participation was still voluntary on the part of the combatants. In the third generation of DDR, things have broadened out even further. The context of conflicts, of course, has gotten even more complicated. DDR doesn't necessarily proceed according to this well-defined formula. It's still informed, of course, by DDR principles, particularly those developed by the UN, but it's negotiated from scratch with the various parties involved, and the scope of what DDR should achieve or should contribute to has broadened. And this is one reason why I wanted to mention these three generations, is because in this third generation, you're talking not just about DDR, but you're talking also about transitional justice, you're talking about security sector reform, and you're talking about economic development and a range of other issues. And particularly given all of the things we've been discussing today, first mentioned by David this morning and mentioned just now by Betty as well, this overload of expectations on different parts of a post-conflict reconstruction, I think is very challenging. And in a way, we brought it on ourselves because, we keep saying we need to broaden, we need to look at different elements, we need to look at different factors. I think the time has come where we need to take a step back and simplify a bit and distinguish between things that are mandated to a particular element of post-conflict reconstruction and the effect that elements can have. So, for example, I don't think DDR should be mandated to do transitional justice. But I think we need to look at the effect that DDR can have on transitional justice and the effect that transitional justice and reconciliation in turn can have on DDR. So I wanted to mention that because I thought it was quite important. Looking at the Sierra Leone context, the Sierra Leone DDR was essentially the first generation type of DDR. There was a peace agreement. Actually, there were 4 peace agreements. And DDR was included in each of these 4 peace agreements. The conflict in Sierra Leone ran from 1991 until 2002. Then you had 4 peace agreements between 1997 and 2001. You had different phases of DDR. The first 2 were interrupted by a reignition of violence between the fighting factions. But the last one, which began in 2000, stuck, so that's good. And then by the end of the DDR process, which was run through a national committee for DDR with support from a range of international agencies, around 76,000 ex-combatants had passed through the DDR program, of whom roughly 6,000 or 6,700 rather, were children. Now, one of the challenges, I think, for the DDR process in Sierra Leone is that women and children were significantly underrepresented in that process. It was estimated, for example, that women made up around 12% of the fighting forces, whereas they only made up about 6.5% of people who ran through the DDR program. And also there was an estimated 48,000 child soldiers in Sierra Leone, of whom approximately 12,000 were girls. But as I said, only 6,700 went through the DDR process. So, I mean, we can talk about the reasons why. I won't go into it now. But, so for a significant number of the former fighters, they didn't have the D or the D, let alone the R. Now, one of the challenges of what was happening in Sierra Leone around 99, 2000, 2001 is that there were, of course, two accountability mechanisms were established. One was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the other was a Special Court for Sierra Leone. Now, neither of these bodies became operational until 2002, so after more or less the bulk of the DDR had concluded, but there were discussions in Sierra Leone within the international community about both of these institutions. And this, of course, was not lost on combatants or who were about to become ex-combatants. 2 minutes, oh goodness, okay. So, I've got 2 minutes, so I'm going to do the Cliff Notes version. Basically, the way that it worked out was that there was no formal engagement between the DDR process and the TRC or the Special Court for Sierra Leone. So there was no real impact, let's say, of the DDR process on the reconciliation process. And there's a number of reasons for this. One is the timing, which I've just mentioned. Another is that there was a distrust of accountability mechanisms, not just by the combatants, but by the people who are running the DDR programs. And when we were doing outreach in Sierra Leone, we did outreach at the Lunsa DDR camp, but we were essentially run out by the people in charge because they feared that it would prevent combatants from entering into the program. So there was overall a lack of thought about having a holistic or integrated system. There was a lack of agreement about how DDR might work with the TRC or the Special Court, and so there was no ability to really get the views of the former combatants and to have them participate, if they wanted, in reconciliation, which would have helped with integration. In the 1 minute remaining. Okay, I'll try. So these lessons, I think, can be useful for the current context. And as I mentioned, one of the challenges in the current context is this issue of extremist groups. The first is a challenge of perception. Now, when you're talking about extremist groups like ISIS, like Boko Haram, for example, we all know who they are, we all know how bad they are, we all know the terrible things they do, we're all afraid of them, and nobody really wants former ISIS members living in your backyard. And this is a problem. For example, there's 44 children who are Tunisian who are in a Libyan prison, and the Tunisians are unable to get them back. They're not combatants. Some of them are 3 years old. They've only known this prison. But the Tunisians are unable to get them back because every time it looks like they're about to reach agreement, the general public says they don't want them back. And in the 0 minutes I have left, I will say counter-terrorism framework, it's going to be a problem. United Nations University is working on this. Happy to talk about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Allison. I'm sure we'll get some good questions that will allow you to continue. Our third speaker is Velma Šaric, and she'll be discussing reconciliation amidst competing conflict narratives. She is the founder and president of the Post-Conflict Research Center, which was awarded the Intercultural Innovation Award by the United Nations Secretary General, among other entities. She is also the founder and editor-in-chief of Balkan Discourse, and several other programs and projects, which I won't enumerate one after the other. She just recently came back, I believe, yesterday from a visit to Colombia where she had a fellowship. And so we are even more deeply appreciative that she's here talking to us today after such a long trip. So thank you, Velma.
Thank you so much, Elena. I know it's late. It's a great pleasure and honor to be here in this, historical courtroom 600. So I have some slides just to kind of make it a little bit colorful. As our great moderator just mentioned, my name is Velma Šaric. I'm from Bosnia. I'm a former war trials reporter, peace-building researcher, and current president of the Post-Conflict Research Center. My organization works in the context that proves to be a struggle for transitional justice processes. The country and the region I came from is shaped by devised pre-war attitudes, incomprehensive post-war agreements that have failed to prove laws of reparation or basic protection for victims, and that have led formal transitional process and justice organization to become inefficient. A governmental structure that lacks accountability. I'm a citizen with 3 presidents who conflicting interests make political advocacy efforts fruitless. I'm also a citizen of the country which have 176 ministries. We have pervasive nationalism in my region, 3 different sides of historical narratives. We have ethnic, religious, and cultural segmentation, isolation, and exclusion that results. Segregated schools, 2 schools under 1 roof, still exist, pure example of segregation. Restricted social institutions and unavailable public services such as education. So we have 176 ministries, but no state ministry of education. Based and misinformed media, which are usually satellite of political parties. A poor economy that results in the most talented youth leaving the country. We are the country with the biggest youth unemployment rate in the world, 70%. In trying to solve all these above problems, there is a large number of civil society organizations that have been established, 19,200. Their work is unofficially duplicated, and mostly they do similar programs and similar mission. On top of all of this, the public simply doesn't trust that these groups are best equipped to solve society problems. So, we have all these problems that affect reconciliation and transitional justice processes. I think that it's first important to look at the term reconciliation, which can be a bit problematic in my country and in the region of the Western Balkans. Reconciliation is a phenomenon that happens on its own time. You cannot force people to reconcile and forgive, especially perpetrators and victims. So what do we seek to do in my organization is first to create an environment where the peace building and reconciliation would be possible, where people will have emotional consensus and communicative resources to extend hand in both physical and online spaces. So we do this in 4 ways. We have creative multimedia and arts. We produce a variety of multimedia materials, tools, and platforms aimed to inspire positive change. These works are displayed online and in traveling outdoor exhibitions. One of our most well-known projects is the award-winning project peace-building program, Ordinary Heroes. Through this, we showcase stories of moral, courageous citizens who took action to save sometimes neighbors, strangers, or people they didn't know during the war and genocide, both in Bosnia, but in all 3 different environments, which is Rwanda, Cambodia, and Holocaust. These stories of cross-ethnic cooperation work to reduce anxiety about other group members, decrease feeling of social distance, and show stories of past reconciliation that hopefully can serve as example to others. Peace education. I'm proud to mention that we do peace education hand by hand with ICTY outreach program in Bosnia. Our program furthers the values of justice, peace, and cross-cultural understanding and reconciliation among today's youth, who will shape the historical narratives of tomorrow. Working both locally and regionally, we carry out youth-based focused peace education initiative so that they can sustain peace and become more practical reality for young people. Post-conflict research. Post-conflict research. So post-conflict research, we guide youth-driven community research and coordinate international research initiative. The idea for this is directly sourced information to be a backbone for very well-informed political and social structure that can lead toward reconciliation and social progression. Our very important pillar on which we are extremely proud, this is the only genocide prevention education going on in the region of the Western Balkan. You know that last genocide happened in Srebrenica. So genocide prevention, violent extremism, and preventing sexual violence in conflict. What we do, we host a series of annual trainings of civil society organizations. We had 120 from the region of the Western Balkans on the best practices and methods for responding to early warning sign of genocide, mass atrocities, and we do this hand by hand with the UN Office for Genocide Prevention and Responsibility to Protect. Major outcome of this program is our coalition, 30 plus regional civil society organizations, that they are better, able to respond to online hate speech and violent extremism, engage with organized groups that promote ethnic hatred, division, and violent extremism, equipment to coordinate efforts in response to genocidal activities. And we do hope that we will create a synergy among this civil society in the region of Western Balkans so that they can act together. The impact of these 4 areas where we work have been seen, through many different, we do a great monitoring and evaluation of all our work. So we have informed decision makers, organized community actors, provided students with economical valuable skills. We created a culture of professional collaborism and inspired inter-ethnic partnership and relationship. We have increased awareness of all these issues and lessons on a global scale. By some estimated, we have more than 350 million viewers of our online documentary series. We also have remained inclusive of all 3 ethnic groups across the region and program we develop. Our model have been replicated in 46 countries of the Council of Europe, that they use our peace-building program, Ordinary Heroes, as education for local and regional authorities how to organize inter-ethnic and inter-religious activities. We do all this, but there is a lot of work which we need to do. So what we must do, and we need to maintain the current status of our work and support the work of our colleagues here and everywhere. The work in the fields of transitional justice and post-conflict society progression. Our work should be also replicable. We can serve as an example to other countries that they are currently in conflict or working on social reconciliation on their own. Global. We believe that stories of the Balkans can resonate and teach others around the world and should be approached as such. We believe that work we do should be informally experienced all around the globe, providing a global lens to often locally oriented problems. We also must remain youth-focused. We must continue to make conflict and complex issues easier to understand for those who will live in this society, and with the greatest potential to shape the better future. With this, I thank you for your time, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Velma. So, in all of the panels I have ever moderated, I think this is the first time I've ever sat on a panel with such strong resistance to the panel theme by all of the panelists. So I found this really intriguing, and I want to invite you to talk about this a little more before I turn this over to Q&A. So I'm going to ask a general question and a specific question, and you can tackle whichever one you want or both of them as you prefer. So the general question is, should reconciliation be a goal of transitional justice processes, or maybe transitional peace processes, either for that matter? Should it be a goal, or is it simply a hoped-for after effect that we shouldn't be trying to directly create? That's the general question. Drawing on Betty's comments on the shift from truth leading to justice to truth leading to reconciliation, on Allison's comments on DDR being overloaded, and on Velma's comments about the problematic nature of reconciliation and that people need to be free to do it in their own time. The specific question that I'll throw out there, in case you'd like to tackle it this way, is if you were offered unlimited funding to create whatever kind of program or project you wanted to, what would you design, and what would be its stated goals? Would those goals include reconciliation, or would the goal of your program be something else? Betty, would you like to?
You want me to go first?
Sure.
Well, thank you. I like your second question, the specific question. If you gave me an unlimited amount of money to design, a project or a program, I would pick a reparations program. And the reparations program would be at once empowering, that the victims that have suffered whatever type of atrocity, and I would pick the atrocity of sexual violence, that those victims who often do not have this really critical voice, whether it's in TJ processes or in fact in courts, that they would have this program that I would invite them to design, and the process of designing that reparations program would itself be an empowering process, that they would be able to recommend measures to ensure non-recurrence, that they would be able to work with policymakers, to ensure that the right legal frameworks exist so that there would be, in fact, not, I'd like 100% non-recurrence, but even if it wasn't going to result in that, that they would be able to get the sort of assistance that they would need that is not, this reconciliation. Because how do you work towards reconciliation for victims of sexual violence? It is not possible. That is not a possibility. They would never be reconciled to the perpetrator, and neither would they ever be reconciled to the states that made this happen, but they may be reconciled eventually to the institutions that would protect them in the future. So that is what I'll do with that money. Your first question, which is the general question, which is whether reconciliation should be a goal of TJ. I have to say that it's a very ambitious goal. I think it's always setting up whatever institution that you want to do this, setting it up to fail by putting it in the mandate. And this is a problem, I think, which has been identified by Pablo de Graaf around the horrendous expansion of mandates of some of these bodies to include everything from truth-telling to institutional reform to investigating crimes for future prosecutions to reconciliation. In South Sudan, where I work now, they have healing as part of the mandate. Really, so I would say no. I would say it shouldn't be. We should go back and reduce, some of these goals that we're attaching to some of these transitional justice institutions and mechanisms, and do what is achievable. Not to say that reconciliation is not a good goal. It is a good goal. Once you've done everything else, once you've ensured that there is measures of justice, there is structural reforms have been instituted, institutional reforms have been instituted, then people can be reconciled in the manner that is described in the Nuremberg Declaration.
Thank you. I would agree with what Betty just said about whether reconciliation should be a goal or not. I don't think it should be a mandated goal. I think that it is impossible to force people to reconcile. So you perhaps set up an institution that has reconciliation as part of its mandate as a goal. You set that institution up to fail. And if you have an institution that has a range of other goals as well, such as truth, or such as accountability, such as participation of victims telling their stories and so on, if you have one part of that institution where the goal cannot be reached and it fails, the question is what happens to the good work that's done on all of the other goals, and does it tarnish the good work of the other goals? So I would not include it as a goal. I would also include it as something that we could hope for, perhaps. And perhaps one question we need to be asking is, do we actually need reconciliation for a society to move forward after conflict? Maybe acceptance or tolerance is enough. I haven't given this question enough thought, but the idea that you have to have reconciliation to move forward, I think, makes it difficult when you can't make it happen and when you can't force people to do it.
So I completely agree with what have been said, because in the context of my country, for example, in the region, we cannot expect that victims will, for example, victims of sexual violence who still, when they go to pay electricity bill, they are paying the electricity bill to their own rapists, especially in small community where, impunity for perpetrators is so high. And then, usually I say people did reconcile. They live side by side. Previously in Bosnia, if you take a look at the media reports, you would see that, especially after Dayton Agreement was signed, you would see so many attacks on returnees, and, we don't have these kind of incidents anymore. And the question is, do we really need to push the reconciliation? We rather use a peace-building, inter-ethnic, interreligious dialogue, because we do see that there is a big resistance for, if we use word reconciliation. So I completely agree. I don't know, does it have to be a goal? We definitely need to work in that pillar for sure. But in the region of Western Balkan, where you have, when you don't have any laws regarding reparations, when you don't even have a databases about how many people have been killed during the war, we still have so much manipulation with numbers, and we all know that moving forward includes exact data of people who have been killed. So we don't even have idea how we will commemorate. We don't have a state law about commemorations and memorials. So we have so many issues by building memorials with no any educational background and bringing much more division among young people. So I like rather the second question. For me, the second question about I think what would be necessary, at least in the region of Western Balkan, would be necessary to definitely take a look, the failures and success of the work which civil society organizations did, because they were serving and they were doing mostly governmental job. We need to do a better monitoring and mapping of these organizations and people who do exist and work sometimes not related to these bubble organizations, We have an issue of having so many civil society organizations, but in reality, their work is not so efficient. So it's necessary to create a synergy among civil society organizations. It's extremely important that we all work together. And if I have $1 million, I would definitely try to be a watchdog, or I would be a watchdog of government and try to push the education reform and try to at least establish a working group which will start to negotiate around the question how we will incorporate the past in our curriculums, school curriculums.
All right, thank you all. If there are any funders in the audience who would like to offer support for these suggestions, you can feel free to volunteer now, but you're also welcome, of course, to offer questions at this point for our panelists. David?
Thanks, and it's a terrific panel, and a lot of good things were put on the table for us to think about. I want to ask maybe it's a slightly heretical question, and it's much more in terms of the peace agreement itself. We can follow the Nuremberg Declaration and put transitional justice measures in the agreement, but the agreement itself may cause a deep problem. I think of the Balkans, which froze a conflict in a way that makes, maybe it doesn't completely nullify the transitional justice efforts. It makes them enormously difficult. For example, the Sudan situation may have some of those same elements, and we, in a way, put in we may load up the peace agreement with justice elements, but they will not be able to succeed because of the underlying political difficulty caused by the peace agreement itself, because the peace agreement either doesn't grapple with the underlying issue, it leaves a kind of frozen conflict, or it's a messy, horrendous political compromise. Now, I realize this is not exactly your subject, but I think it's a very important one. I wrestled with it for years dealing with the former Yugoslavia, and I think it's one that repeats itself, and in one way, it raises the issue of where are the peace negotiators. Maybe they should be in the room too. So, thank you very much.
Why don't we go ahead and take a couple of questions and then bring it up. I should have said that you should also state your name and affiliation, and that was David Tolbert from ICTJ. And there was someone who raised his hand earlier in the
Yeah, thank you. I'm Rainer Hule from the Nuremberg Human Rights Center again. And if you allow, I would make a modest proposal, and that is to banish once and for all the term reconciliation from the transitional justice discourse. I think it has only created confusion and many times deception from the very moment where you transfer it from the interpersonal relationship where it belongs and it's of much value to the political and societal sphere. And we have so many alternatives to reconciliation. I will propose democratization, inclusion, participation, and many other things that also signal that we are in a process, because that's my other concern with reconciliation, that it has a subtext, or rather a sub-sound, that is extremely conservative and creates the illusion that by the reconciliation we would return to the previous state of the art, which is never the case, because if that was a conciliated society, you wouldn't have the conflict that now makes us speak of reconciliation. But we have to be clear that after these conflicts, be it internal, repressive, or war conflicts, we are in a completely new situation. We have to look forward for new ways of forming a society, and I would never call that reconciliation, because it is misleading totally. So that would be my modest proposal.
Let's take one more question from David Scheffer in the front, and then we'll do a round of answers.
Thank you. David Scheffer from Northwestern University. I have questions, just two very short ones for Ms. Šaric and Ms. Smith. First, Ms. Šaric, with respect to the Western Balkans, I felt that what you were trying to say to us in terms of these tremendously encouraging activities that you undertake in your organization is that reconciliation is not an explicit objective, but rather it's an implicit consequence over generations. You seem to be focusing a lot of your attention on the youth and of bringing them together. My own exposure to the Western Balkans would lead me to think that if you try to persuade the current generation that went through the war and the terrible situation with the victims to reconcile, it's a very, very difficult mountain to climb, because so many of them want justice, quite frankly. But if you are focusing your activities on the youth, which it seems to be what you're trying to accomplish, you're looking at a 10, 20, 25-year time frame of making that generational shift that ultimately will result in reconciliation. But it's an implicit one, and I just wanted to know if I'm on the right track with you there. And of course, that's lessons globally. I mean, you can do that in all parts of the world. And then, Ms. Smith, you didn't get a chance to follow through on your timing on what I thought you were trying to get to, which is, were you trying to distinguish how you try to implement DDR with guerrilla groups versus terrorist non-state actors? There's a different process between the two, and if you could just elaborate DDR distinguishing between those two groups, I think that would be extremely interesting.
Reprieve, thank you very much. You've allowed me to overcome my timing challenge. Yes, what I wanted to say is that DDR or release, particularly in relation to children from terrorist or extremist groups, faces different challenges from other forms of DDR that we've seen in the past. And the reason for this is the application of the counterterrorism framework, in part, where governments are required to prevent or punish, for example, membership in a terrorist group. So what you see is even if children, for example, because this is what I do a lot of work on children and extremist groups, if children are being released from extremist groups, or they're being captured, for example, in Mosul, they're being released by Boko Haram, they don't go through a DDR process, they get put in administrative detention. And it's an indefinite administrative detention. And for some reason, and I don't really understand why, we seem to have forgotten that they're children. We've forgotten that they have rights. We've forgotten there's a DDR framework. We've forgotten there's applicable international humanitarian law. We forgot we have to act in the best interests of the child. And so, I mean, it's really a big challenge right now, and I think it's going to get more challenging as more numbers grow, particularly of children who are being released, as ISIS is being defeated in some areas, and more children are being released. So, I mean, I don't have an answer. I'm not sure if we are able to learn what we can learn from the past in order to help these children. I know their reintegration is going to be extremely problematic if we can get them to the point where they are able to reintegrate. And I mentioned these children in prison in Tripoli, 44 of them, 23 or so of who are unaccompanied. They don't have parents with them, their parents died. They're not combatants, they're 3, as I mentioned, but it's not possible at this point to get them out. So this is complicating DDR or release, and I think we're going to continue to see these challenges into the future, not to mention when you throw into the mix the question of foreign fighters and what happens to them. So that's what I wanted to mention, so thank you very much for that.
Thank you for your question. I want to say something regarding frozen conflict. Yes, it's completely true. I mean, we are a result of everything what is going on is a result of the Dayton Agreement, for which we know that it shouldn't be like permanent. We hope that it will be just temporary solution. But unfortunately, our politicians, they really like to pick things they like. So reality is that for now, Dayton Agreement cannot be changed, and the fact is that we have these 176 ministries, and they are like full administration, not just one person. You know, Switzerland have 6, we have 176. I also know that there is like a large flood of young people who want to leave. There is a large depression among young people. When you show up and you say that you are from non-governmental organization, they look at you like, oh, one more, what do you want? Accomplish your goals and you will leave. So to engage them directly in peace-building process on any way, it's almost impossible. But I mean, we need to offer them alternatives in a country where every single politician is currently under the court for like criminal or like nepotism or, you know, corruption. We need to try to give them an ordinary people as a heroes, because if their professors are, you know, those who sexually blackmailing the female students for grades, if they have if they have a wrong models, they don't have any opportunity to think about better future. So this is just, I know that it's on a small scale. I wish we can do something, you know, more, but we are trying. And yes, it's true. I mean, the victims, they want justice, but in reality, we have so much pressure on our national court, which is like established in 2005. It's a court which needs so much support. I mentioned how these politicians are putting the pressure because they are under investigation. You know that we have been, you know, by the pressure of like a Prime Minister of Republika Srpska, he forced all international judges and prosecutors to leave. I mean, we all have to have three judges. How we will have independent judiciary? That is actually what our concern should be, because according to war crimes strategy, the national and entity courts will prosecute, you know, like a large number of very sensitive cases. So we need to empower the courts. And what I'm doing is on a small scale, but I mean, I need to give them a hope, because everything else is so dark, that this is the only way, and I do believe if we do grassroots and we create a grassroots activists, they will bring more people and they will bring more people. And there is a great example, I need to mention this. Young people from central Bosnia, from Jajce, who were going to divided schools, like 2 schools under one roof, they actually, like 2-3 months ago, started to protest, and they were requesting to go to the schools together. So now they are pushing the change of the federal law. So, yeah, I mean, those are small things which are giving me the hope, but it's not an easy job. It's not at all. So.
I want to respond to David Talbot's comments and question, really comments, because I think they sort of reflect my own thinking around how the agenda for reconciliation is generated. If it's generated via a peace agreement, then when that peace agreement fails, as they often do, then that agenda is out of the window. And if the peace agreement succeeds and the institutions are created, then those institutions that are supposed to push forward and carry forward this, whether it's a truth agenda, whether it's accountability agenda or a reconciliation agenda, it becomes an official project. And this is the problem. In Burundi and in the DRC, where the peace agreements have failed, the justice mechanisms too have not been generated, organically. And I think we need to change our thinking around how we are putting all of these mandates in peace agreements. I like your suggestion that perhaps we should be having these conversations with those, I don't know what they are called, they are negotiators or mediators, but we know them. The Kenyan peace agreement, in fact, the title of the Kenyan peace agreement was the Dialogue and Reconciliation Agreement. What anchored that agreement and what seems to anchor most of these agreements that are being concluded in recent times is the power sharing provisions. And so that tells you immediately that once the power sharing provisions do not work, then all of these other justice provisions that are included in the peace agreements are going to have a problem. And so we must be able to generate these agendas from somewhere else. And I think that's thinking I think we all must do. And there are many, now that you've mentioned it, I can think about Addis Ababa on the South Sudan, Nairobi for the Kenya Dialogue and Reconciliation, Lome, Sierra Leone. There are so many, Burundi, DRC. I think it's time we started to also reconsider why we are putting the provisions around TJ measures in peace agreements, because it is we here in this room who do it. We provide them with the statutes, we provide them with the ideas. We have cloned Truth Commission mandates in many, many peace agreements. And now, thankfully, we're beginning to ask those questions about whether, it serves the purpose for which the goals were established and the principles have been established.
Thank you. Sorry to jump in. But on this question of the peace agreements, I listened to what Betty said, and I agree with all of what you said. My counter voice, I guess, another perspective, is the question of whether a peace agreement will have a chance to get off the ground if it doesn't include accountability. Maybe not, perhaps, blueprints or copies of things from somewhere else, but at least a mention of a commitment to accountability. And the reason I raise that is, the work that we're doing in Syria with all of our Syrian partners, they will not accept a political settlement that doesn't have accountability in it. So it would be doomed to fail for that reason as well. So I guess, it's all context specific, but I wanted to add a counter point. Thanks.
I saw 2 hands over here before. No? Yes.
Certainly asking this on Centre for International Law Research and Policy. I'll just make a quick comment since you are talking about the peace agreements. We actually just completed a joint a study jointly by the United Nations and the World Bank on conflict prevention. And we did test on agreements, testing using new constitutions. So where there were new constitutions, conflict was 60% more likely not to reoccur, right? So maybe this tells us, but we didn't test, and perhaps the comments raised say that we should be looking at whether they're preceded by peace agreements and the nature of those peace agreements that then either precede constitutions or do not precede, then if constitutions are absent thereafter. Maybe this says the establishment of a constitution says something about the commitment and elite reconciliation that informs the peace agreement, right? And that really goes back to the question that I was originally going to ask before that discussion happened, which is about how you perceive broader societal reconciliation, like as compared to, say, what Mamdani might say about the prerequisite of elite reconciliation, and the relationship between that and justice, right? So how do you see any tension between whether there are all actors to a conflict coming in and at what time, and whether the process is imposed from the outside, or whether it's the local actors actually driving the peace process? This is something we tried to look at, but we don't have the evidence, right? So at present, we just have opinions about peace agreements where some people will say, oh, it needs accountability in the agreement. We don't have any evidence to say, yes, that's right, or no, that's wrong, really. So do you, in the cases that you looked at, what is your sense in terms of the integrity of reconciliation and what drives that? Is it the localization of the elites? Is it the external enforcement, like someone suggested Dayton might have been? Yeah, I'd like for you to speak to that, if you can.
Hello, my name is Hanna Bodesen. I work at Maastricht University. I have a question on the role of the civil society, and especially in the Balkan context. I'm thinking of NGOs that, like yours, but also some others, and I'm thinking especially of one or two that are most active in Serbia, that somehow seem to just annoy everyone. And I mean, especially in the political landscape, but also amongst the general population. And I'm wondering, working myself on that region a lot, where do you actually strike the balance between, you know, bringing up topics that are important and doing work that is, in my view, obviously extremely valuable, and I'm lacking of a better word, to annoy the population that ultimately actually has then detrimental effects to reconciliation and moving on and getting together again. So I'm wondering, where do you find the balance between letting people let go and reminding them of the difficult work that remains to be done?
Bill Pace with the NGO Coalition. This has been a very provocative, I think, panel, and I appreciate it very much. I was Googling the term reconciliation, and I had 4 different dictionaries and about 9 different definitions. It was an interesting process there. And I think many of us would certainly agree that it needs to be truth and justice. I'm not sure if there is a third point to these commissions, what that is. But the other question was a little bit similar to the previous question, which is, here we are sitting in the Nuremberg building, and after tens of millions of terrible murders and crimes, and has there not been some reconciliation that has occurred? And how do you address that? I think the idea that you expect a commission to come up with a reconciliation plan is, as many of you mentioned, unrealistic, but I'm not sure the concept over the long term isn't fundamentally important for the concept of peace. Thanks.
Okay, so let me say something about these peace agreements first. I mean, at least in the case of like Western Balkans and what I can say as a citizen, living over there. The thing is that there's not like what actually was the main problem is that there wasn't any strategy behind this like peace agreement. We had a bad luck, let's say, that immediately after intervention and war had been stopped, we lost our Balkan office in the State Department, and the U.S., who played an important role in stopping the war with the Bush and 9/11, completely shifted the focus. So it's maybe, I cannot give a good answer about that. I'm living one peace agreement. I'm like daily trying to kind of like struggle with the consequences of 176 ministries. To do this job, I will just like briefly mention, to bring one of these like public outdoor exhibition on a public square, it's a pure hell. You need like 15 or 20 permissions. You need to kind of call like 15 or 20 people, and they don't even use the mail, they use fax, because nobody doesn't want to see. So the fragmentation and result of peace agreement is on the ground non-imaginable. I'm going to talk about civil society. Yes, like the civil society in the Western Balkans, they, especially women movements, like Women in Black and the Humanitarian Law Center and organizations working over there and in the region of Western Balkan, they really did what our government didn't. They were doing a governmental job, even with like databases and providing a support for victims who would take a part in the trials, providing support for victims of sexual violence. We don't even have a system for them. They were playing really, really important role. But the thing is that now, 25 years after, and the problem is also, which we are dealing in civil society, is actually the shifting of focus of donors. So, they are thinking that the reconciliation or like peace building or whatever, this work can be done in 10, 15, 25 years, and then suddenly, you need to turn around to the gender mainstream or to EU or NATO. And in reality, that is why there is not so much confidence of ordinary people in the civil society, because they see civil societies sometimes also like, those who don't actually want to push for change. I'm always saying, we have a fair and democratic elections over there. We are electing those, those politicians. And I'm always saying, or we need to work hand by hand with the government, or we need to be a watchdog of government. But navigate between is not solution, because it's almost 30 years, and we are losing new generations of young people. So yes, there is a lot of resistance, but there is also, work which was done by civil society organizations. So, but now we need to create a new strategy. We definitely need to look where we will go. So.
I guess what I wanted to address is this question of long-term reconciliation and peace. And okay, maybe you do need reconciliation in the long term. Maybe I take back what I said about not needing it. But I do think it is a long-term process. And maintaining a sustainable peace is also a long-term process. And I think that the problem with having reconciliation as a goal of an institution, for example, that's only established for 6 months, 2 years, 4 years, is that there's no way you can achieve that goal within that limited time, and you can't impose it from the outside. You can't make people reconcile. What you can do is take the steps that need to be taken to create the conditions where reconciliation may happen, recognizing that might be, as you said, it might be a generational issue. So, you need to promote understanding, and we saw this in Afghanistan, for example, people in different parts of the country not understanding that everybody else in other parts of the country had terrible experience as well. And, you know, a lot of work was done by the Afghan Independent Human Rights Commission on documentation that allowed this kind of understanding to develop. So that's a useful step. You do need to be looking at healing trauma so that trauma doesn't pass down intergenerationally, which is always a risk when you have mass atrocities and genocide and things like that. But then another aspect of it is for example, the reintegration part of DDR is often one of the elements that is less considered in terms of preparation of the ex-combatants, and particularly children, for return to society, preparing society to receive those children back. But there's an expectation, let's say, that it can be done again in 6 months, which is not possible, particularly when you're talking about children who are released from groups like ISIS or Boko Haram. It's a long-term thing. And, you know, Velma made the point about donors, and I completely agree. I mean, donors have to focus on this as a long-term process. It's not something that you can fund for 6 months or a year and hope it's going to be okay. So, yeah, that's what I wanted to say.
Well, thank you. I think I'll speak to Bill's comment. Has there not been some reconciliation? There has been reconciliation. I think in this panel we were reflecting on reconciliation following official transitional justice processes and sort of reflecting on those types. As we meet here today, there is a meeting of African transitional justice experts. And by African, I mean people who work and practice in Africa. It is happening in South Africa, and it is hosted by the Center for the Study of Violence and Reconciliation, and they are bringing forward a lot of examples where reconciliation has worked. The other thing that they're doing is they're formulating, they've actually formulated an African transitional justice policy, which is they're doing in collaboration with the African Union, and they're going to adopt that African transitional justice policy to guide transitional justice practice on the continent. One of the interesting things that is coming out is that, in fact, people of African descent, they say, are able to forgive and therefore are able to move forward on issues of reconciliation. This is a conversation that is happening, but it is an important conversation because it highlights the question of context being important in considering the issue of reconciliation. So I didn't want to give the impression that in fact there has been no reconciliation. It is within the context of these official processes that I was, sort of making my remarks. The question of restorative justice as an important path towards reconciliation, I think, is also another very interesting conversation that has been happening, and the practice that I don't know how successful it has been in Rwanda and Uganda, but certainly officially sanctioned reconciliation. Going now to Chris's question about whether there is any evidence of the integrity of that sort of reconciliation, where the state itself makes it a policy, a goal, a 5-year goal. It becomes the goal of the state to achieve reconciliation. They set up commissions. In Rwanda, they had something known as the reconciliation, the National Unity and Reconciliation Commission. In Kenya, we have a Cohesion and Integration Commission that works solely on reconciliation. And in those commissions carry out projects that include anything from changing and implementing primary school curriculum, university curricula, to teach people how to live together, to achieve the goals that are in the principles, but now doing it from an officially sanctioned position. Whether it works or whether it has integrity, I think this is a study that has to be done. But certainly, in some countries, there has been no more war after these commissions have done their work. But other events may point to the fact that there has been, no reconciliation at the individual or at the community level, but at the state level, then the actors have been reconciled. And so I think that would be an interesting study also to look at.
We have time, I think, for one more short round of questions, if there are any. Yes, over in that corner.
Hi, thank you. I'm Julia Klaus. I'm a student of the University of Passau. My question goes mostly to Betty Murungi, but maybe the other panelists also want to speak on it. So you mentioned in your original talk that as a truth commissioner in Kenya, you found the judiciary to be complicit in crimes. And that reminded me of the criminal organizations the IMT in this very room also dealt with. So far as I know, this concept was not taken up in later tribunals or in statutes. But my question would be whether you, from your experience as a commissioner, feel that a focus on such organizations could be a viable or a satisfactory compensation for that high selectivity of international justice we talked about several times today. So do you feel it would be satisfying for victims also, or would it be something you can stop many, many individual proceedings by focusing on larger organizations and put that to rest then? Thank you.
The Kenyan judiciary was investigated by the Truth Commission, was one of the institutions that came under the purview of looking at institutional failures that led to the continuation or the deepening of the violations that were being committed against citizens. And the reasons for that was stated in the report. Other institutions that were examined were the police and the military. At this point, I can't remember whether there was another one, but those three were the three institutions that were found to have been complicit in aiding and abetting the violations that were committed in Kenya against many, many individuals. Part of dealing with that problem was not to recommend individual compensation, but people who had suffered because of decisions that had been made by the judiciary during the period under investigations were encouraged to bring lawsuits. And many of them, in fact, had brought lawsuits against the government. And the government actually ended up paying people who had been detained on trumped-up charges, who had been detained illegally without trial, and so on. But the most important aspect of reparations that came out of the process of fingering the judiciary as a violator was the judicial reforms that happened. Now, the process did not come as a result of implementing recommendations by the Truth Commission, although the recommendations were there, but it came as a result of a parallel process of institutional reform that was ongoing at the same time that the Truth Commission was conducting its hearings. So judicial reform actually began with constitution making. So that is where it came from. So there were parallel processes that were going on. The police reform, establishing police oversight authority, the judicial reform establishing a process by which judges were not handpicked by the executive, but actually had to go through a process of vetting and establishing a Judicial Service Commission. All of these reforms were established in the new Constitution, which actually was passed before the Truth Commission completed its work. So I think there has to be an acknowledgement that processes that are working at the same time and being reinforced by a constitution that is far-reaching, that is respectful of human rights, that has a strong, Bill of Rights section, is important in terms of getting reparations for, many victims of those institutional violations.
Thank you. I'm not going to attempt to summarize this wide-ranging panel. I do want to take a moment to identify a couple of additional themes that came out in the Q&A period, in addition to the question that we started with of whether reconciliation should be a direct goal of transitional justice processes or not. A couple of other themes that emerged included the incredible importance of timing to what sort of processes we're engaging in and how and why. The need for treating children immediately emerging from conflict in a different way than the sorts of education programs 30, 35 years after a conflict. Second, the frequency of situations that complicate our reconciliation dichotomies. So children who are both perpetrators and victims, child soldiers, are the most obvious problematizing situation, but also questions of victims of sexual violence and whether people who've experienced that kind of violence are going to be resistant to reconciliation processes in a different way than people who've experienced other kinds of harms. Finally, I think it also emerged that there's not only a question of whether we're overloading TJ processes by asking them to take on reconciliation in addition to their other goals, but also a question of whether we do harm when we link different kinds of processes together, either by requiring transitional justice in a peace agreement or by linking the results of truth commissions to reconciliation, having either multiple goals or processes that require an additional process or institution to be successful down the road in order to be considered successful themselves, all complicate transitional justice and peace-seeking in ways that we might want to reconsider. So thank you to you all for a very thought-provoking panel and to the audience for sticking with us at the end of the day. And with this, I'll close and thank our panelists. Wish you all a good evening.